A very good evening to you and welcome to this week's Wednesday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. Tonight on the show we look at the problems that have paralyzed the country's intelligence agencies following a proposal today by parliamentary committee chairpersons for an inquiry into what rendered our intelligence services so effective in the past 2 weeks. And still dealing with the consequences of the looting spree as well as the violence and destruction that accompanied some of it, our panel a little later on looks at what should preoccupy President Cyril Ramaphosa and his economic cluster of ministers now that they have had a meeting yesterday with the country's business leaders. The Watchdog starts now. Well, the chairpersons of Parliament's Police Committee, as well as the chairperson of Parliament's Committee of Committees, have made a proposals which, of course, they are yet to table before Parliament. That proposal seeks to look at what happened over the past few weeks that made it virtually impossible for the country's intelligence services to do what is expected of them, what the Constitution and the laws of the country allow them to do in order for them to protect us as South Africa. Now, that proposal, as I say, is yet to go before Parliament, but they have both indicated, the committee chairpersons that is, that this is something they will be proposing to Parliament very, very soon. So what exactly happened over the past 2 weeks also has far and wide implications for how the country's state security apparatus conducts itself, because they do rely a great deal on the intelligence that is supposed to be provided by some of our operatives. Now, former Intelligence Minister Ronnie Kasrils is on standby to talk us through some of the things that he knows, some of the things he has encountered in his previous life, things that perhaps could have saved us a lot of time and energy, but more importantly, things that would have ensured that we are not caught unawares by the events of the past week, of the past couple of weeks. Before we go to that conversation with the former minister, take a look at what the two committee chairpersons I spoke about had to say today as they were on a fact-finding mission looking at what happened and what could have happened. Matlaku Komane has that story.
Both committees have agreed that police were overwhelmed and unable to respond adequately to the lootings and violence that broke out in some communities. Jomad Peterson says Parliament will call all security cluster ministers to appear before them to resolve the impasse of whether police had received and ignored intelligence that was provided to them a week ahead of last week's lootings in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng.
The Portfolio Committee of Police will call the entire JCPS cluster to account, which will include all the ministers, the Minister of Defence and military veterans, the Minister of Police and the Minister of Safety and Security, State Security. They'll come to the Portfolio Committee, and it is there where we'll get to the bottom of what is happening. So we will not leave the matter here. I think it is important that we speak with one voice, and that is the role of Parliament.
However, it would seem an appearance before the Portfolio Committee may not be enough. The chairperson of committees, Cedric Frolick, says they will recommend a parliamentary inquiry into last week's looting and violence.
The views that are already coming out very strongly is the need for an in-depth parliamentary inquiry into the events of the last week. That will ensure that some of the questions that you've been asking here this morning is covered, so that we know exactly what happened, where there were certain lapses in the responses that were supposed to be there, and also we don't want to get involved in what the different members of the executive are saying, Chairperson. That will be part of such a process. So in the report that will go to Parliament, this issue of a parliamentary inquiry will definitely be submitted so that the Speaker and the House can consider it so that we can get to the bottom of what has occurred.
Both committees say that a report on their oversight visit will be made available to Parliament and the public. Mahlako Komani, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, let's explore the issues further. And joining us on the line now is Ronnie Casrels, who is the former Minister of Intelligence. Good evening, Mr. Casrels. Thank you so much for your time. The two committee chairpersons say they are going to recommend an inquiry. Your thoughts? Please unmute yourself.
The oversight.
Okay. Great. Now we can hear you now. Yes.
I hope that they keep to their words. I think they're waking up very late. Parliamentary oversight is vital. And they should have known long ago. In December 2018, the Mufamadi high-level panel into intelligence gave its report to the President. It went public quite soon after, and it pointed out the dysfunction in the state intelligence services, the state security system. It was a huge indictment. And in fact, it goes further. It talked about political infighting there, political objectives, the fact that so much corruption that they actually called it a milk cow, that everyone was milking it. So it was totally dysfunctional. It didn't have the capacity, and we knew this all along. It goes back to a report I commissioned in 2008, the Matthews Commission, which said much the same thing and said what was required to do. That was ignored by the Zuma administration, and up to now, 2018, the President still, unfortunately, hasn't followed through with the recommendations. But that's my first point about parliamentary insight. You're asking me of oversight. You're asking me as a former minister what my experiences were, and I can tell you how disappointed I was in the period of being minister, 2004 to 2008, at the toothlessness, the disinterest, the fact that the Oversight Committee of Parliament into intelligence was showing itself to be deeply politicised, and I'm talking about the ANC grouping there, which has continued. We just hope that the recent years, and especially now, has shaken parliamentary oversight up so that it must do its job for the country. Going into that Mufamadi report, it spelt out the alarm bells. It sounded those alarm bells. So it's not surprising that we've been caught napping, because the intelligence agencies, from police to certainly the civil intelligence under the security minister, are not fit for the job. They've shown themselves not to be competent, and this was pointed out. So let me come to the latest problems, if I may.
Just before you do that, I just want us to go through this step by step, if you allow me, Mr. Casrels. And I want to start with the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence. I mean, as you have just pointed out, that Mufamadi report said that committee, of course, I mean, it is not one of the two that conducted their oversight visit today, and as a result of which the two chairpersons came out saying that they are going to recommend an inquiry. We're talking now about the Joint Standing Committee of Intelligence, which you say has frustrated you in the years that you were minister, which the panel led by Dr. Mufamadi said, and I quote, has been largely ineffective and impacted by the factionalism of the ANC. The committee is divided and unable to articulate a coherent collective response on the state of intelligence in the country. The question I want to ask you is, what does that do to the effectiveness or lack of our intelligence services? The fact that this committee is torn apart and in the main by the shenanigans within the governing party.
Well, it becomes part of the problem. It's supposed to be oversight. It's supposed to be a watchdog. It's supposed to ensure the capability of the service. And it has failed, certainly in my period. And when I watched intently, as the whole country did, the shenanigans going on during the Zuma years, we could see that the ANC in Parliament, its caucus, and its committees were just not doing their job, from one scandal to another. So one cannot say that there's no responsibility at the door of the ANC in terms of the causes of the mayhem that we've had to live through this last week ago. So that's my response. And actually, the other committees in Parliament, the police oversight, that has been no better. We've seen what has been going on with crime intelligence. It's as bad as the state civilian intelligence agencies. It's the dysfunction at state level. And in this vital area that is so crucial to the safety and security of our people, which the Constitution stresses must be the task of government and the task of these services, we've seen that this is utterly downgraded, incompetent, and not fit for purpose. So that's one of the key things that have been ringing out so loud and clear.
Now, in attempting to answer the question, what went wrong, Dr. Mufamadi's panel also talks about what it calls a doctrinal shift. It talks about how from about 2009, there was a marked shift in the intelligence community away from the prescripts of the Constitution, the White Paper on Intelligence, and the human security philosophy towards a much narrower state security orientation. Now, that is probably even more alarming, you know, because if, you have an intelligence. You have your intelligence services drifting away from our constitutional values and our constitutional prescripts. Then the situation is even more dire.
You know, absolutely. And you said from 2009, we know which president came in to rule and ruin this country. After 2009, that drift that they're referring to is the drift away from leaving aside the incapacity factors that I've referred to, but from an outstanding constitution and its references to state security and the services therein, and the white paper and the legislation, the control mechanisms. Yes, everything always looks good on paper, but that was the intent. And I struggled with it. I found at that stage that there was the drift that is referred to, because it was all about their involvement in the succession from Mbeki to Zuma, which a strong faction preferred. And then once Zuma came to power, he mismanaged, he used the state security apparatus crucial to his positions, crucial to somebody whose only object is to protect himself or herself in a position of authority, and started undermining the regulations, the rules, the actual constitutional imperatives. And it became a fiefdom of Jacob Zuma, a fiefdom in which it began to serve his own personal interests. And you could see that immediately in the move that he brought about from the fact that it was a former Minister of Intelligence Services, and I'm not enamored with having a minister in charge of these things, by the way, into the State Security Department, an emphasis therein away from service and security for the people to state security, because that was and has been Jacob Zuma's game and the grouping around him to maintain their position of power for their nefarious means. That's what the Mufumadi panel is getting at. And that's, again, behind the rot, the dysfunction. We've seen, for instance, what had occurred under Zuma, which was totally illegal, and that was the president himself fixing things right within the service, which is supposed to be under the Director General's control, the operational sector. And he created a special operations section under a man called Tulani Dlomo. And this was to report only to him and therefore to serve him, and became this sinister grouping that, of course, and I've referred to the oversight factor of Parliament. They knew that was happening, and they never blew the whistle. So responsibility goes back to them too. But that's my answer to you, Voya.
But also, I mean, Brony, if you add, I mean, apart from the politicization and the doctrinal shift, I mean, if people can walk into, the offices of the State Security Agency and come out with bags full of money, there can hardly be an incentive for them to do the right thing. I mean, their eyes will be and their energies would be focused on getting the money and doing whatever they want to do with it, and focus less, if ever, on the work that actually needs to be done.
In anything but a banana republic, there would have been alarm bells, heads would have been rolling, the president would have been called before Parliament to account. And just like what happened in the building of the Nkandla Palace and so many other things, the fact that computers were stolen, the fact that money, millions, disappeared, there was never any accountability, what did that say? And what did that say about the role of Parliament? What did it say about the role of Cabinet? What did it say about the ANC, the ruling party? This is why we've got to a stage today where we've seen this mayhem.
Now, I want us to take a listen to what the Minister of Intelligence had to say here on the program the day she and other ministers like the Minister of Police and the Minister of Defense had to appear before the media to account for what happened or for what didn't happen. Take a listen to what Minister Ayanda Dlodlo said here on the program on the day.
You would realize that at no point did he say we did not have information. And that information was provided. But were there enough police and soldiers on the ground? The answer is no. There were issues of logistics as well that were involved in all of this. And again, I don't want to be seen as throwing Minister Cele under the bus, because this is a collaborative effort. We were not caught sitting on our laurels. Information had been flowing. I've given figures.
So, the Minister of Intelligence on the day insisting that she did what she is constitutionally mandated to do, compile a report, give it to her clients, as she called them. But then, Yesterday, which obviously was days after the Minister of Intelligence said what she said there, yesterday, this is what the Minister of Police had to say.
We have given the product. It's you, Minister, that should have given the product to me. Because the Minister of SSA could not give the product direct to the other DG. It would have to come via me, and I gave it to the National Commissioner. And I want to repeat here, I've never seen that product. Not that I have never seen that product. These products you sign when you receive them. You sign. When you receive the product of state security, you sign. You go and check my signature.
I gave it to him. No, she didn't give it to me. What does that tell us, Mr. Castros, about where the executive is? What should we read into this, especially if one adds to it the fact that the president, who's the head of the executive, was given this report more than 2 years ago, but it would seem that hardly any of the recommendations were actually ever implemented.
Sure, okay. When you say the report 2 years ago, you're referring
I'm referring here to the
high-level panel.
Yes, to the Sydney Mufamadi's panel's report.
Yes. Okay, but coming now to Minister Dlodlo, the whole point, the very essence of intelligence and the person in charge, who's the minister of that agency, is to forewarn. And when it comes to something as dangerous as what we've faced, who is the authority that you rush to? You go to immediately the president, not the DG to the president. The minister must go immediately to the president to alert the president. Secondly, somebody like the Minister of Police is vital. Obviously, anybody involved in security of the country is vital. So it is said by the minister that it was presented to the Minister of Police. I can't comment on that, neither can you. We don't know. But what we insist on is that we must get to the bottom of this. And the parliamentary committee, this is the first thing. They must insist and grill those ministers. They must also ask the Minister of Security, why was this not presented to the president? Or was it? It doesn't look like it to me. So something in the state of Denmark is very fishy. And it does come back to the Mufamadi report and the fact that I've raised this publicly, that President Ramaphosa needs to explain why 2 years ago there's been no follow-through, no implementation of extremely serious recommendations by the Mufamadi panel over 2 years, except for a few little changes in personnel. And some of the changes are really very worrying as well, because some people who have been mentioned over the years in terms of dodgy dealing within intelligence have been put aside and are in other positions in government. So President Ramaphosa, at this particular point where we've come to such a crucial stage in our country, I hope this is the silver lining of getting things done seriously, has to grasp the nettle. He also has to explain why he hasn't acted, and he needs to begin to act very, very actively in relation to Mufamadi.
Mr. Casrels, that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Thanks very much for your time and your insights this evening. That's the former Intelligence Minister, Ronnie Casrels. And still looking at the consequences or things that have been thrown up by that looting spree, as well as the violence and destruction that accompanied some of it. Our panel in a short while is going to look at what should preoccupy President Cyril Ramaphosa and his economic cluster of ministers now. And this, of course, following a meeting they had yesterday with the country's business leaders. That's coming up in a moment. So now, President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday met with the leaders of business. He was not alone, of course. He was with the premiers of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, as well as the economic cluster of ministers. The meeting, of course, scheduled to discuss how to help people who were affected by the looting we saw over a week ago. But, of course, as one would expect, the conversations inevitably progressed to look at the broader, bigger underlying issues of economy, issues of how this country can create jobs. And that is what we're going to look into in this segment. And our first guest is Xolelwa Kadia from Indlulamiti Scenarios. What they have been doing over the past 3 or so years have been to look at these scenarios leading up to 2030 to see how are we measuring up to our goals, what keeps changing on the ground to influence the direction that the country is taking economically. Xolelwa Kadia joins us on the line to talk us through what a report that they issued, in fact, a few days before the looting spree that we saw over a week ago. Xolelwa, good evening, and thanks very much for your time. Very, very briefly, the report that you tabled, what did it tell us about our country, where it is, and whether, in fact, we are in line to meet our goals?
Good evening. Thank you for good to the viewers at home. I think before responding to your question, I just need to take a step back just to give a bit of background on the scenarios. As you would know, these were launched in 2018, and the idea was to provide a long-term view to the different pathways that South Africa could actually experience in the next coming period leading up to 2030. So we came up with 3 storylines or different alternatives for the countries, which were bourgeois, an enclave bourgeois nation, which is a nation that's really more divided by inequalities than we currently are. The second one is Nailewok, which is a nation that is in step with itself, and that means one that has more cohesion. And then Kwara nation, which is a floundering false dawn where we see a state of lawlessness and restless energy amongst citizens with a demoralized land of disorder and decay. So when we wrote these scenarios, we had key driving forces that inform any of these 3 pathways. And the driving forces would be issues of resistance and resentment. That's the first key driving force. And the next one, leadership. And then the third one being inequality. So these are the things that would take us towards cohesion or away from cohesion. So for the past 2 years, we've been releasing this barometer result, which then indicates which of these forces are pulling us to any of the 3 scenarios. So for the past 3 years, we've been slipping deeper and deeper into the Kwara nation, which is symbolized by a demoralized land of disorder and decay. So for the past 3 years, the result has been getting worse and worse. And if we look at this year's result, the one we released on the 15th of July, we are now sitting at a point where we are even more than half, we've passed the midway point. For the expression of Kwara, we're at 59%, which is very close to 60%. Expression of Gwara indicators, meaning that when you look at those, what you see is that inequality has the strongest pull towards the state of lawlessness. So that is the one thing that takes us there.
So the events of the past 2 weeks should really not surprise us. Now, when this initiative was launched, there was a great deal of fanfare. I remember the president was also there and gave a speech. Over the years, did you get a sense that you were being listened to, and not only that, but also heard by those who have the power to actually do something about what your reports were telling us?
Absolutely. We have been speaking to government from the highest office, provincial government, and even at local level, and also stakeholders from business and civil society, and we have been heard. Others have even expressed that this Gwara scenario that we are now talking about is actually quite mild in terms of what we seem to be foreseeing in the next foreseeable of COVID-19. We've seen the intensification of some of these elements with some of the things that we imagined would happen after the 2024 election happening in the past year. So we have been heard, but I think the biggest challenge is that of leadership and specifically capacity within the state. So the state is unable to take us out or pull us out of this Gwara setup or this reality that we are facing. So according, we have found that it would require a more collective effort. So business has to come to the party, civil society has to come to the party, and that can be achieved through a process of social compacting, because government alone will not be able to, because they do not have the institutional capacity, nor do they have the skills at times to pull the country out of this rut.
What, though, has been missing from the leadership core of business, labor, civil society, and let's start with government? What has been missing there? What has been missing? That which, has allowed us to, as you said, sleep?
Well, when it comes to leadership, it's not government alone. I mean, I might have.
No. I'm saying, if you could, if you don't mind, saying, this is what has been missing from government. This is what has been missing from business. This is what is missing from civil society. And I'm saying, can we go through those in that way, if you don't mind?
All right. With a good example in terms of government would be coordination and alignment of, imperatives or goals or targets that are set at national level. How do we make sure those translate to activities at local level? Because you find that citizens encounter the state at local level, but decisions are at level, and at times there's no alignment. In terms of business, we find that at times they tend to wait for the state, and they would expect the state to provide policy certainty. The state is not capable. We cannot have a big business that folds its arms and watch. And we've seen a slight improvement.
Is that what they've been doing, though? Business, that is.
There seems to be a trust deficit and a lot of finger pointing when it comes to those two parties. And at some instances, it could be informed by ideological differences. So that is something that needs to be resolved, wherein when you go into a company setup, there has to be the spirit of compromise and give and take, where you don't come in with the idea that, you want to win all. You should be able to forego some things. And I think that's what's lacking across the spectrum, whether it's labor, civil society, government, or business.
Now we have to release you because you've got to go across to another interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much
for your time this evening. That's Xolelwa Kadia from Indlulamthi Scenarios 2030. Let's bring in now Izam Mhlanga and Sifiso Skenjana, who are chief economists at Forbes, Alexander Forbes and Intelligence IQ, respectively. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen, and thanks very much for your time. Sifiso, you heard what Xolelwa had to say. Just your thoughts, just from what you've been able to hear from her, from the time she took us through what they had done, what she thinks has been done by those who have the power and the wherewithal to actually do something about the rather bleak picture that her organization has actually painted.
Good evening, Boyo. I think, one of the things that's certainly coming out from the point that she is making is that I think we've been asking the wrong questions around what are the real drivers of the discourse that we see from a political as well as a socio-economic political context in this country, as well as then who are the role players in the context of that discourse. And I think, she rightly mentions that we all have our roles that we need to play, either as government, as private sector, as civil society, in driving the sustainable developmental outcomes that we need to see in the context of our economy. And, in context of what we've seen, for example, happening in KZN and Gauteng, we actually saw society coming up and standing forward. We've seen businesses also coming up and standing forward, and actually we've also seen government coming up and standing forward. And so I think the social contract in the context of South Africa is certainly not a dead thing. It's, however, just around where do we channel our energies to ensure that we get the biggest bang for our buck. And I think that's certainly where we should start asking the right questions. I think you also look at the report that came from Policy Lab earlier, showing very well that a lot of the hotspots from the right point of view had also highest Gini coefficient in the context of the country, and therefore that talks about levels of inequality. And so what it talks about is that when you've got high levels of inequality in societies, there's also big social risk that is embedded in that. And so how do you leverage policy to be able to respond to those challenges? And I think that's where we should start moving towards in order to ask the right questions around truly ensuring that South Africa is an economy that is inclusive for all who exist in it, as well as that creates the right level of opportunity for all people who are in the economy.
Izam Mhlanga, your thoughts, just listening to what Xolelwa Kadia from Indlulamthi Scenarios had to say? Unmute yourself, if you will. Okay, it looks like you can't hear me. We're going to take a quick ad break. This conversation continues right after this. Welcome back, and if you've just joined us, we're talking to two economists on the back of a report that was tabled some weeks ago by Indlulamthi Scenarios, which showed that our country is not really going the direction we would have really wanted to take. And our economists, who have been, both of them are economists, but also they are columnists. So they have been writing about these things, putting forward their ideas. And apologies for what happened. I don't know what happened there, but I want to move right on because out of yesterday's meeting that the President and members of his economic cluster of ministers, as they met with businesses yesterday, to look in the main into what could be done to help those who were impacted by the looting in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng. And among the things we are told, well, certainly from a statement that the presidency set out, was was the issue of restoration and maintenance of stability with the increased deployment of security personnel, but also securing essential supplies by opening critical supply routes between KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, and of course to the rest or the most part of most provinces in the country. Now, obviously, that would have been a departure point, because something needs to be done to help those people who have been affected. But then the meeting, we got to understand, then went beyond that to talk about structural economic issues that perhaps provided fertile ground for some of what we saw. In your view, what should be foremost in the minds of the president and his members of his economic cluster right now? We're expecting them to make pronouncements over the next few days. What should be preoccupying their minds right now?
Vuyo, I think it's quite important to think, yes, in the short term, but also to think long term in terms of what is required to be done. The in-calamity scenarios, they do identify clearly what is the biggest cause of poverty, especially amongst the youth, and that is the skills or education levels, where it correctly identifies that those that have a post-matric qualification, they do have an unemployment rate of just over 8% compared to those that do not have a post-matric certificate. I mean, if we look over the short term, yes, there may be a need for a contingent response to try and help those individuals that find themselves in extreme poverty. But as the discussion is going on, a basic income grant that is universal is simply not affordable. And especially if you just look at the current fiscus, which we have been on a consolidation path. I know there is a lot of debate out there, but if we do not have a permanent source of revenue that is going to be used to fund a universal basic income grant, we will be plunging ourselves into a path where we find our fiscus unsustainable and potentially even venturing into a default in the years ahead. The problems that we have are not new. We have known for a very long time. Unemployment has continued to rise, but we have not spoken about how do we generate the employment levels, but also how do we increase the productivity of the economy, which is the one that generates more GDP and more revenues for the state that can be used to support many of the social spending.
And that is what is the problem, and that is what is, frustrating. So many people speak so because, and I'm reading again for like a line or two from that statement that the presidency sent out last night. The meeting agreed on the need to work with greater urgency to tackle poverty and unemployment and improve the living conditions of all South Africans. Now, we've heard that before, not once, not twice, over and over again. The statement continues, among other things, this requires a common effort to mobilize investment, develop appropriate skills, and create opportunities for young people in particular, which is what Izar has just been talking about. But the fact of the matter is that these conversations don't seem to be able to go beyond, being statements. What is the problem?
I think we are certainly putting too much emphasis on rhetoric, and we're not, putting our minds into how do we immediately put programs on the ground that can transform the lives of young people. One of the, for example, suggestions I've made in the past is that how do you leverage procurement as an enabler for small and medium enterprise development, right? What you found, and I remember I always play back the example of Clicks, after they had a challenge with a racism row, first thing they did was respond and say, we're going to open up our market, our supply chains for small and medium emerging black enterprises to try grow into becoming large-scale suppliers into our ecosystem. South Africa is home to a kind of what we call an oligopolistic market structure, where you tend to find a handful of big organizations across all sectors, banking, retail, etc. And therefore, these are the spaces where these are budget-neutral approaches, for example, that can see sustainable growth of small and medium enterprises that are run by young people. And so if you bring these people into these supply chains and you support them through real sustainable enterprise development structures that are guided by some legislative frameworks, I think that's one of the things that we can certainly start to put in place to ensure a successful and a more sustainable trajectory from young people participating in the economy. The second thing is that we're not investing in innovation and research as well as ideas. As per NDP, our ambition for what we call the gross expenditure and research and development GERD is an ambition of 1.5%. We're currently spending 0.5% of our available budget towards innovation. What that means is that we become increasingly, we will lose competitiveness in a global context. And we can see that in a lot of the labor-intensive sectors, South Africa has actually regressed in terms of its competitiveness. And that's one of the things that's driving higher import intensity and therefore resulting in a decline in a lot of these labor-intensive sectors that can absorb the kind of labor force that we currently have, that Isaiah alluded to, that is largely unskilled. And so on the one side is that we can look to the future, but we also need to create an economy today that can absorb the exact kind of skills that we've got today while we try to think about what does it mean to future-proof the economy from a skills and education point of view. So
we're not putting our money where our mouths are. What else can we do that's very practical, real, and that's within, our collective means?
I think we have to look at other countries on how they did it for us to get an idea of what could be done. Take Singapore, from a very small island, the steps in terms of policies they took, enable them to grow to a very strong country that is more equal on earth than any other country. You could also take Rwanda, not far from where we are, from 1994, decimated by genocide. Today is one of the fastest developing countries in the continent. It has to start with leadership that identifies exactly where we should be as a country and ruthlessly implement those policies. Let me just mention one. We have a lot of big malls in townships, the so-called township economy, that by and large are owned by big business. Why is it so difficult for the private sector to come and join hands with local communities to say, in a big mall, there are spaces that are reserved for local communities to also put their produce, whether it's small farmers, whether it's small bakeries that also participate. What we have seen is this exclusive agreements that pushes away small businesses from local communities participating. That's just one. But again, as Fiso mentioned, the procurement of government is a big spending item that government does on a year-to-year basis. But what we have found is that government takes too long to pay those small businesses, and as a result, they collapse. That's one of the issues that could be done. But overall, if we do not make the investment environment more conducive, it's going to be difficult to attract foreign direct investment. It's what we see the world over. It's not going to be unique for South Africa not to be able to attract investment because we are not doing the right kind of stuff that enables businesses to operate in a conducive environment.
Sfiso, which sectors of the economy offer, not so much readily available sort of things, to do, but which among these sectors are actually allow us to do a lot more within a very short space of time, while of course capitalizing on the fact that they are able to absorb more people and very quickly, and perhaps not needing the kinds of skills that would require or that are found only from a very small portion of our population?
I think there are a number of sectors, and so I think from a services point of view, we've seen that the business process outsourcing sector which is in essence what we call the call center industry right now, is actually one of the largest growing sectors in terms of its export capacity. That's been growing at what we call a compound annual growth in excess of 36% per annum. And that means that globally now economies are starting to seek the South African value proposition in terms of what we offer from the business process outsourcing sector. That's also a sector that's employing on average about 86% black people, about 60% of those are young black women. So it's already a sector that's showing growth. It's showing also a transformative lens and an inclusive lens in the way in which it is growing. I think over and above that, I often talk about how in South Africa we've got very interesting parallels that run in the formal economy as well as the informal economy. So,
unfortunately, gentlemen, unfortunately, that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Sincere apologies. We had very little time for this part of our conversation. Economists Sfiso Skenjana and Izar Mhlanga. And that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Thanks very much for joining us. Do join us again tomorrow evening. From me and the team, have a very good night.